Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's okay. I just thought I would jump on now while I got some spare time and do the next episode of the Kinsey series that I was doing. We've done part one and two. Part one was the introduction about how I was going to lay this out and make it, you know, in digestible pieces, I should say, for the viewer, because it's too much to handle otherwise for a lot of people. And we did Alfred Kinsey's early life and his childhood and his progression and how he became a sexologist and how he became in a position to do the research that he was doing in Indiana University, or the Kinsey Institute as is known. So that was where we left off last time. Now, I am going to break into two parts of this as well, because he collected obviously a lot of data. We need to find out, where he went for that and whatever. So I'm going to do the adult first. Because his goal, for the people who haven't seen, go back and watch part one, I would. But Kinsey's goal was to basically his study on human sexuality. He was trying to prove that everything was completely normal. There was nothing unnatural about anything, including bestiality, paedophilia, whatever, because we're mammalian. That's how he was a Darwinist. Then that the other animals do the same thing, and therefore rape is fine, and all sorts of really dodgy stuff. But he set out to, I say prove, quote unquote, because it's he's not proven anything, but that's what that's what his work was to do, was to basically collect what he called sexual histories from people. Don't forget, this was, try and keep in mind where we are on the timeline as well. This was back in the 30s and 40s, where people were far more conservative than they are today. It was much, much less liberal. In fact, the reason we're in this mess today is because, well, I say because of him. He was a massive, massive, massive influential person in the whole of that. So bearing in mind, you've got to think of the times. Now, for people who were very conservative back then, there wouldn't be even many people to offer their sexual history. What he set out to prove was what people did in their sex lives wasn't what they portrayed on the outside. Basically, what were they really doing behind closed doors? This was what he was trying to prove. So he, with his work, basically he said, he did thousands of histories, thousands of sex histories, and then he stated that, he said that it was representative of the American male population and female, but we'll stick with the male because that's the first publication that he did. So before he collected these sex histories, he obviously had to have a staff, obviously people who worked for him. Now, the people who were very close to him, they had to be a certain way. So they had to be completely liberal. They had to be completely open about anything sexual. They couldn't be shy about anything. They had to actually engage in sexual acts with Kinsey. If you remember from the first episode, I told you that he was actually a closet homosexual. He got married as a front. He needed to portray himself as a happily married man with children to even be able, because of the way the world was, to be able to get into this position. But he was a closet homosexual, and he was a sadomasochist. So just bear that in mind. The people who he worked with had to be the same. He was very sort of, he was precise on that. Anyone who was, conservative in that way, they wouldn't get near this project. So they had to be the same way minded. And he groomed a lot of them. He groomed, especially Clyde Martin, who was actually his gardener initially, and he didn't have any sort of background in any of this. But he used him because he would engage in sexual activity with him, and he was open about it and whatever. So this is how he employed people then, if you like. This is how he employed people. So for the male volume, I don't think Paul Gebhard was the male volume. I think he might have been the female volume. But anyway, he had Clyde Martin, Wardell Pomeroy, who co-authored Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, which was his first publication. And then later on, Paul Gebhard. They were close knit. His wife was helping him with these things as well when Kinsey was doing his pornography videos in his own attic at home, and he was basically having sexual relations with students, with people. Just it was just a big, huge sex fest, to be honest. And he actually had a room in Indiana University. He had it soundproofed. He had this room soundproof. So I don't even know what went on in that room, but things did go on in that room. And they were fully behind it. Obviously, he was the Rockefeller Foundation was his funder, believe it or not, and others as well. So when he got his staff, he did this sort of interview technique, which was coded, right? So it wasn't like, say, if you look at a survey now or you look at a questionnaire now, it'll clearly have the question and then the answers. Kinsey's was coded, and he made all of his staff learn all of these codes for these specific questions off by heart. That was obviously to keep things very, very confidential, and we'll find out why later on. But that's how he did things. So he became the marriage counselor at school, at university, because he pretended that people were asking him, the students were asking him these sexual questions and whatever, which they weren't. That was his way in. We talked about this last time. So what he was doing, he was collecting what he called sexual history. So he would put these, students or colleagues or whoever through these histories, and anyone that wanted anything to do with this, he had to take their sexual history first. So later on in the series, we'll talk about who was supporting him and the kind of blackmail and things that we used. He was an asset in the end, but I'll try and keep it sort of to the point on each one, so we'll talk about that later on in the series. But as you can imagine, he had a lot of information on people. But so I think it was 18,000 histories he collected all in all. He used to go to around the country, right? So, we're thinking he's presented to the world and in his publications, this is representative of the American male population as a whole. So, all of these laws that are in place, sexual laws, sexual protection laws, they shouldn't, because if they were conscientiously applied to everyone, then 95% of the male population would be in jail. That was what he said, right? Because he was saying, behind closed doors, these things do go on. So who was he using? Who was his sample? Now we're to believe that the sample was unbiased, and it was completely random. So it would have been a mixture of every male, every type of status, every race, every religion, every sort of variable within the male population of America. But what he was actually doing was a huge proportion of his sample, like 80 something percent of his sample, were male and female prostitutes, homosexuals, pedophiles, sex offenders. He was actually going into prisons. He was going into jails, and he was interviewing sex offenders, right? And pedophiles and whatever else. And he would go to the places. San Francisco was very, very sort of liberal and very open, especially with the bathhouses and things back in the day. So he would go to, which is not the point here is it's not representative of the average male population. He was specifically targeting these places. And when you're doing a sample, there's a huge bias there. Even other sexologists at the time, Abraham Maslow was one of them, who actually, he agreed with him with a lot of things, but he tried to say to Alfred Kinsey, your sampling is wrong. Your methodology you're using is wrong, because when you're doing a volunteer survey, you're going to have, especially with this subject with sex, you're not going to have most of the people not going to offer that to you. You're only going to get the people who are very open about their sexuality and very promiscuous, and they brag about what they've been doing. They're the types of people who are going to come forward and give you a sexual history, not the average person. So you can imagine, this whole sample was taken from the really hyper massively promiscuous homosexuals in the bathhouses in San Francisco into prisons with sex offenders and pedophiles. And he also used 9 known paedophiles for the data in sexual behavior in the human male and sexual behavior in the human female. Now, what he did, this obviously came out later. This information wasn't available at that time. It only came out afterwards, and there's plenty of evidence, and we'll talk about that, sort of moving on when we talk about the actual data, what he was saying. But those paedophile, you can't, so within his publication, and I've read it, you can read chapter 5, which is the actual child data, if you wish, on Public Child Protection Wales's website. It's on there from that publication. It's horrific, by the way. It really is horrific. So I'm just giving a caution there, read with caution, because, it can really trigger people. But what he calls them, he calls them adult partners. So when he's referring to the abuse of children, he refers to the rapist then as a trained observer or an adult partner. So it desensitizes the reader immediately, because you're not even thinking in those terms. It's very clever how he did this. Does this all the way through. But keeping to the adult side of things here, I'm going off on a tangent a little bit here into the child data. That's who he was actually using for his data. So just think about that for a minute. Does that represent the male population? No. And when he was told at that time by other sexologists and by other statisticians and by other, professionals in that field, he ignored that and just went ahead with it anyway. But then that was his main goal. His main goal wasn't to study what human sexuality really was and what people were doing behind closed doors, really. His whole goal was to normalize his perversions. That's what his goal was. And he actually did it, but with help with other people, which is why, because it sounds unbelievable initially when you say it, but then when you realize the bigger backstory, which I'll talk about a bit further on, that's when everything will sort of click in and make sense to you. It really, really will make sense to you. It's horrendous. So we've established now that he's done all his sex histories. Mostly a big, massive portion of those were not representative of the average male population of America. Right. So this was the data he then presented into his books. So the reason I've got Judith Reisman and Alfred Kinsey is I will do next time I do a video, it'll be on the child data. So I will give a definite trigger warning at the beginning of that one, because that one is going to be very, very hard for people to listen to. Really difficult. But I'm just trying to paint the picture here and sort of present how we got to this stage. So this is why I'm doing it in smaller chunks, because it's more digestible. I think, taking it all on board in one go when this is the first time you've heard it is really hard work. For anyone who does want to just jump in feet first, though, I will leave my website below on this video, or link to this video. If you go into I've done plenty of videos, but the videos are kind of sporadic because I've got there's a lot of other stuff, obviously medical stuff, vaccine stuff, whatever on that side. So if you want to just sort of stick to Kinsey, go into my blogs, into the news. And I've done about 6 or 7 blogs on Kinsey. And they are a hard read. They're really difficult to digest because of it's unbelievable. It really is unbelievable. So if you're happy to do that, then I'll leave it there. If you want me to carry on doing it, I'll carry on doing these bite-sized chunks for the people who, who don't want to know it all in one go, which I completely understand, because it's really difficult. Honestly, it really is difficult to suck up. So the reason I've got Alfred Kinsey versus Judith Reisman is because Judith fought this man's work for for 4 decades, but right up until the day she died. And she was an absolute wonderful, wonderful woman with so much information. And I'll do a whole episode on her and her battle against him, but against the sex industry. What I did want to say as well, just before I end this video, Kinsey was the one who made pornography mainstream. So while he was doing his collecting these sex histories, and while he was, doing all of his dodgy stuff out in the real world, while pretending to be a disinterested scientist just looking for the facts, he was performing pornography videos up in his attic and in, like I say, in the Kinsey Institute as well. So he and then the man who took over the reins for him and became his pamphleteer was obviously Hugh Hefner and Playboy. So this is where the connection goes then into the sexual liberation movement as a whole. And this lady was pretty much single-handedly battling it, and she was outstanding. So we'll do one on her as well. But next time, guys, I'm going to leave it there. Just wanted to just for you to have a view that the sampling that Kinsey used was not representative at all of the average American male back in the 1930s and 40s, nowhere near. And the reason it's so important is because, like, all of his work, like I keep saying, like we keep showing, has been drip fed. And even now, today, every sex educator is trained by this man, whether they realize it or not, whether they even know who he is or not, and they probably don't even know who he is. So that's why it's so important, and we can see this in society today anyway. So anyway, guys, I'm going to leave it there. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll be back next week to do the really tough one, which is on the children, the child data. So thanks very much for listening, and I will speak to you soon.